this main idea, but I've been interested in it for quite some time and thought it would be a good tea time talk to give a gentle introduction to the core idea. But before I really get into what predictive coding is, there's this subfield in cognitive science that's really looking at the brain in terms of predictions, or in terms of trying to learn expectations of future sensor data. And it has this kind of broad term, the predictive brain. Some people have used this label. Bubik, for example, has a really nice review paper going over lots of different examples of the predictive brain. And I just wanted to give a really large picture of all the different terms and all the different ways people use or think about predictions in the brain, and really wanted only to show this slide to go, hey, look, a lot of other people are considering intelligent agents in terms of predictions at the very core of what it means to be intelligent, or to make behavior, to have behavior in the world. And we don't necessarily, when we're looking at GBFs and how to use them, we don't have to start from first principles. We can go and look at some of these other ways that people have already thought about and use them for building our agents. Whether or not all of these are useful for the reinforcement learning framework, who knows, right? Some work still needs to go into all of these to understand them in that context. But I think it's definitely a good place to start as we start expanding our use of general value functions. But as I said before, I'm going to focus on predictive coding. Hopefully that echo doesn't continue. But and that hierarchical and the parentheticals is really there. It was first called hierarchical predictive coding, the specific type of predictive coding that I'm going to talk about. Predictive coding has been used quite a few times in the literature, and later work uses predictive coding without the hierarchical to mean the algorithm or like the architecture that I'm going to talk about. But before I get into like the mechanism of predictive coding, I'm just going to lightly touch on what it is actually to code. Like, what does that mean? And I have a definition up here. So it's a mathematical theories on how the brain encodes and decodes information, sensory or otherwise. And really, coding is just looking at or trying to come up with mathematical models for understanding how neurons react to stimuli. And that comes off as encoding information, because right now the thought, and I think we all have the same thought, is that as we go higher up in the layers and as information or as signals are passed through the brain, those signals are encoding some amount of information about the signal so that higher levels of the brain can form behavior or do thought or do other things with it. And there's lots of different ways on or different ideas on coding, on how the brain does this. Some of them are compatible, some of them aren't compatible at all. A lot of these have different constraints or different ways they view the problem, right? Some, like rate coding and temporal coding, really look at the firing rates of neurons, whereas efficient coding and population coding looks at neurons as in like groups and coming up with constraints around those. And the reason why I'm particularly interested in predictive coding, but also coding ideas in general, is this discovery by Mountcastle in 1997. So he described the organization of the neocortex in this paper, and from what I understand, this is really the first description of the neocortex. And what he found was, at least in monkeys, is that the neocortex is pretty much the same across the entire thing. And for those of you who don't know, the cortex is responsible for a lot of the higher level processes of the brain. So things like language processing, and it also contains visual processing and other stimuli processing. and I find this really interesting. There's also some really interesting discoveries or observations that show, so someone who's blind from an early age has parts of their cortex redefined, so parts of their visual cortex redefined more towards like auditory or other kinds of stimuli, leading into some of those old wives' tales of blind people have better hearing for whatever reason. I don't think that's ever been proven in the laboratory, but it's really interesting that they've been able to show parts of the brain that are for visual processing be more, align themselves towards more auditory signals. And it really begs this question, and I think this question or this idea comes up a lot across machine learning and especially deep learning, is that is there one algorithm across the cortex, or is there one algorithm which rules them all, where we can basically learn representations, learn how to process stimuli for use by the agent? And I really like that idea. And I think taking ideas from cognitive science and from computational neuroscience could be a way to start trying to understand more about how to build representations. And so I'm going to come back to predictive coding, the thing that we care about. And this term predictive, I just went on a long rant about how there's lots of different ways we mean prediction and lots of different terms used. I'm going to be careful and define it here. So predictive and predictive coding really means myopic expectations of the sensory motor stream given a history. And this isn't exactly correct. This is correct at the very bottom layer of the system, but let's just like dig into it to really see what's going on. And so the core piece of hierarchical predictive coding, or of this architecture, is some type of predictive estimator. This could be a generative model. It can be something else. But this estimator is, all it's trying to do is make a prediction of the inputs, of what's coming in, of the stimuli. And that gets passed to some type of error function or some type of error calculating neuron. And that can be like squared error, absolute error, doesn't really matter. And what gets passed forward is the error of this prediction. So it kind of turns on its head what we usually think about in hierarchical models. In hierarchical models, and this error gets fed forward and so on and so forth, right? And so there's subsequent layers up to the network. To get back to the point, in hierarchical models, usually what's being passed forward is some filtered version or some modified version of the inputs. And it's the inputs directly. What I really like about this idea is it kind of turns that on its head and has a very beautiful explanation for what feed-backward connections do. And for those who are unfamiliar, in the brain, there's connections going all over the place. And as far as I'm aware, the feed-forward connections are a minority of those connections. And there are a ton of connections feeding back down through the layers, feeding signals from higher abstract neurons down into lower parts of the visual stream or other sense stream. It has a beautiful explanation for that, but it turns on its head what we usually do in machine learning and reinforcement learning when we're building representations. And I quite like the idea. Whether or not it's actually happening in the brain, who knows? When it was first introduced, the main reason they came up with this architecture was to explain end-stopping neurons, or end-stopping neurons. And let's just go over that real quick, and it kind of illustrates why this is such an interesting architecture. So the pink thing on the left here is a neuron, and you can see it's firing. And if you follow the black arrow over to the receptive field, which is that center dotted box, so the receptive field is basically, you can consider it the the place where we place this rectangle in the visual field, and this neuron maximally fires. And for those who are familiar, this is an on-center receptive field. You can see that the stimuli is inside the field and only inside the field, and it's firing. But there's this interesting behavior when the rectangle extends outside of the receptive field. And what happens is you get this kind of neuron, and it's certain types of neurons in the visual stream which do this. You get these, you inhibit the neuron firing when the stimuli extends beyond the receptive field. And there's been a few ways to explain this, but I feel like having this ability to have the prediction come down from the higher levels, and then that being the inhibition signal, or the basically telling the neuron, oh, I don't need this information anymore, is a really interesting concept. And it feeds into another idea, which is efficient coding, which basically says the brain needs to save energy and needs to encode as much information as possible and basically have as little redundancy to conserve energy. And I think this is a really cool idea. So now that like the core concept, now that I've gone over the core concept, I want to talk about an instantiation of it. So David Cox's lab wrote a paper not too long ago in 2016 where they described this deep architecture called predictive networks, or deep predictive coding networks. They called it PredNets for short. And it's just as pure of an instantiation of predictive coding as you can get in deep learning contexts. And there's some fudging a little bit, right? So what I have up here is just the architectural details of what their system is. If you focus on the right, you can see the input coming in. I don't know if my mouse, hopefully people can see. Yeah. So you see the input coming in. It goes through some layers to create a target. This is then passed to the error calculating part of the network, which produces the output, which goes into subsequent layers and is fed back into some representation layer, which keeps a history. And that is used to make a prediction. And so when they're calculating the state or like the predictions, there's this two-tiered or two-stroke process where they feed in information, let it flow through up the network, and then back down through the network to get the predictions on the next step. And this is completely unsupervised, right? Or I guess it would be self-supervised in the more modern way of thinking about it, where the predictions being made are completely based off the data coming in, right? There's no supervised signal. There's nothing handed to the agent which says this is the right answer, this is the wrong answer. It's all grounded in the videos that are passed to the architecture. And I really want to show this video, hopefully, where is it? Sorry. Okay. Let's mute. And so there's this phenomenon called the flash lag effect, and that's David Cox. I'm stealing his video, where you see the flashing bar that is happening every now and then is kind of lagging behind the non-flashing bar. And I'm just going to pause. Is lagging behind the non-flashing bar, even though the way they're presented they're actually perfectly parallel. They're not lagging at all. And what you're now seeing on the right is the predicted or like the what, after training on this example, what the prednet came up with, or what this architecture came up with. And it's kind of hard to see, but you also see it lagging. And the question is like, oh, is it lagging because I'm also experiencing the flash lag effect? And in a second, he's going to show some still frames, right? And you can see that, so this is the actual, you can see that they're completely parallel, right? This optical illusion is a true optical illusion. But what's being predicted by the network is what we see, which I think is really interesting, just from a cognitive, like just from understanding what's going on in the brain perspective, right? If this like hapdash version of predictive coding is able to come up, or this just falls out of that, maybe this is a little bit more evidence towards that, or evidence suggesting that maybe this is happening in the brain. Of course, there's lots of different other ways of explaining the flash lag effect, including postdiction, and other various theories. But I thought that's a really interesting, and it really sent me down this rabbit hole of thinking about predictive coding and thinking about what it could mean for our networks, or for like creating representations and reinforcement learning. So they also do synthetic data, and they do natural image data. This is just an example of them predicting or reconstructing or predicting the next frame of a face that's rotating on two axes, which personally I think this is pretty good in terms of what I've seen before. They compare to a deep autoencoder, but not not modern adversarial generative networks. Is that my 5-minute warning? Yeah. And it works pretty well. Less interesting than the other thing I brought up. So I always like to try and get like, oh, this is a beautiful explanation of what's happening in the brain. But there are a few issues with predictive coding that I think I'm just going to be honest about, right? Even though I think it's a very beautiful idea, there are problems with it. One, they're focused on myopic prediction. So they're focused on these one-step predictions, getting caught in the one-step trap. Given how the architecture is constructed, I'm not sure there's a way around this while also maintaining the balance between feedback and feed-forward information. But it's an interesting to think. It would be interesting to think about if we could take the generative model or the predictive estimator, replace it with GVFs and see what happens. Also, there's a line coming from predictive coding, headed by Andy Clark and Carl Friston, towards developing a description of behavior through these principles. The terms that you can look up are active inference and the free energy principle. Personally, and I've had several conversations with a few people, these aren't very convincing, both from like a practical, I want to implement this in in an MDP form, and also from the standpoint of it actually being implemented in the wet works of the brain. But there's a lot of controversy around these topics, and I think it's fair to point that out. Also, like just tying back to understanding how the brain codes things, there are a lot of key empirical results that are missing. One important one being the feedback connections being predictive of the inputs. It's not that people haven't tried, it's just that these are really hard things to measure, and the brain is really complicated. And I think people may be working on it. I'm not as familiar with the like more empirical side of neuroscience. I've been focusing mostly on like the computational aspects of things. But I think that's if predictive coding is to be the algorithm on which the neocortex works, I think these results really need to be shown. And then another kind of a jab at prednets. Prednets, like all of the deep learning architectures before it, require global information to train, such as the gradient. I didn't talk about the loss function before, but the loss function of the prednets basically is just the error of that first layer that we talked about. So it's basically it's minimizing the error that the first layer passes up through the network. And I think it's okay, given where we are in machine learning, that it needs this global information. But I think there is a possibility that we could design an algorithm that can learn from this kind of structure through local information only. And I think that's a really interesting direction for applying this to reinforcement learning architectures. Another thing that I'd like to bring up, so there's two books that led me down this path. One is On Intelligence by Jeff Hawkins, in that he describes hierarchical temporal memory, which is his stab at understanding the brain in terms of predictions. And he's done a lot of work with his company Numenta on implementing this and showing that it's happening in the brain. And then Andy Clark, who I mentioned earlier, Surfing Uncertainty. It's a relatively good book. It's really dense. And it takes a while to digest and get through. But it explains a lot of these ideas much more eloquently than I can. And then just before I leave you, I want to just give you some caveats at looking into cognitive science. A lot of us really like looking into cognitive science and animal behavior. And some of the things that I've learned while looking into this is to take everything with a pinch of salt, right? Like research in cognitive science and neuroscience and other fields is ongoing, and their goals are not always aligned with our goals, especially when it comes to providing details for an implementation or even thinking about how things are implemented or could be implemented in a machine. This leads to things that actually are impossible to implement in a machine, or not impossible, but NP hard. So there's a result for predictive coding, which states that if the generative model or predictive model is unconstrained in certain ways, it's NP hard to actually learn, which is disappointing, but it's good to remember everyone has different constraints when thinking about this. But I think it's very beneficial to be inspired by these ideas on how the brain works. But on the flip side, I don't think we should be constrained by these ideas. Intelligent machines, or generally intelligent machines, if we ever get there, are very certainly going to look very different than human or organic life. And I think that comes down really hard that comes down to the fact that machines work on a completely different paradigm, right? Like the way things are wired in the brain is pretty hard to simulate in a computer, and we should be focusing on things maybe that are inspired by how things work in the brain, but more focused on what works well in a computer. And so as I wrap up here and go into the Q&A session, I want to say a special thanks to Alex Tierney, Johannes, Gunther, and Nico, and a lot of the members of the MMRG. A lot of these topics have been discussed in several groups, and especially those three I mentioned explicitly. And a lot of my thinking and like the work I'm currently doing has been inspired by these people and the conversations we've had about predictions and predictive coding in particular. So thank you. Okay, questions?
Hi, Matt.
Hello.
Thanks for the talk.
Mm-hmm.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
I can indeed. Let me.
Okay, thanks. So you mentioned, sorry. You mentioned that the loss function often looks like just the error from one layer to another.
Mm-hmm.
This sounds to me a lot like gradient boosting. Has any of the work that you've looked into make connections with that kind of classical approach?
So I don't think I've seen any like direct connections to gradient boosting, but yeah, you're correct. This is I think it's someone else has brought it up before that this is similar to gradient boosting. I haven't read too much about those models, and actually predictive coding from the start was inspired by some of the early work on doing video for streaming, right? Like it's this idea of compressing by only storing the errors or like the changes of frames. But yeah, yeah, correct. Yeah, I think that's a great place to start looking and see if it is exactly the same or if maybe it's different in some ways. And that was Dustin, right? I don't see your video.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks. That answers
okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Hey Matt, I had a quick question. Yeah, first of all, thanks for the cool talk. It was quite interesting, but I think I missed something in the motivation in the sense that we showed this diagram about brains having this column of neurons in parallel. Could you again explain how that was related to predictive coding?
So the core idea is that this architecture is implementing predictive coding. And maybe I should have made this link more explicit. But this architecture is implementing predictive coding, and this occurs throughout the entire neocortex or the entire cortex. And so the idea is that there's one algorithm or one core like architecture, a way the neurons interact with each other, which is guiding a lot of higher level brain function in the cortex. And that's really the connection.
So is there something special about the arrangement of these neurons in the sense that these are these parallel columns? If it was like some other way, could it not be the case, or is there something special about this arrangement?
I don't know enough about like the particulars of this organization. So so I would say that predictive coding is one possible explanation and could be implemented by this columnar organization. But there are lots of other implementations. And if the cortex was arranged differently, maybe there would be a different algorithm. But it's hard to really say and answer that question coherently. And maybe I'm not even answering the question correctly.
Yeah, I think, I was just wondering that, so maybe there are these columns and there might be some connections between them.
Oh yeah, so there are layers of connections. You can see, and in the On Intelligence books, he goes into this in a little bit more detail. I just haven't. Where's my mouse? Where is my mouse? I don't know where my mouse is. So in 4C alpha, you can see connections breeding across that layer. You can also see connections in the first layer and in the 6B layer. And all of these contain like feedback, feed forward, and they're all intertangled, right? So like the bottom and the top of the neocortex contains lots of connections to all different parts of the brain. And the center, I'm pretty sure, makes connections across the layers in the neocortex. Whereas, and the bottom, like it's all like a beautiful mess of no one really knows because it's too complicated to really measure. But yeah, there's connections all the way across. But it's interesting that they occur in certain places, and you get this kind of structured column column kind of structure throughout the neocortex.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
Hey, Matt, Patrick here. Do you want to comment briefly on the differences between what you're showing here and some of the cerebellar organization? Like exactly how the cerebellum implements predictive processes? I mean, I'm fascinated by the cerebellum. I think it's super cool. But it is slightly different than what you're pitching here. I thought maybe that'd be a fun thing to unpack if there's time.
I would love to go more into that. I actually don't know too much about the cerebellum. I do know that there's evidence of like a more TD style algorithm happening in the cerebellum, but as far as neuronal organization, I've been focused mostly on understanding predictive coding and the neocortex. But I think it's an interesting question and something that I definitely want to look into more in understanding the differences.
One of the cool, maybe I can say why I think it's kind of cool. Besides us at one point to Rich, oh, hey, Rich, did you know that like general value functions in the cerebellum actually look like the same thing? And he's like, well, of course, which of course we always like, oh, well, we should have read more. One neat thing is where the cerebellum projects. So if we buy the argument that there are short time scale or medium time scale forecasts like we'd make with the general value function being made in the cerebellum, which actually has lobes, blew my mind. Where it projects is really interesting, and it projects into things that like regulate muscle tone and cardiac speed. So essentially you're looking at changing small aspects of the policy or the way a policy is implemented based on those downstream connections. And so it's really, really neat. And it does say something about building predictive models or coding the world in a predictive way, and then that having a direct impact on policies. So anyway, I think it's super cool. I would encourage everyone who's interested in this to also check out our friend Cerebellum, because it's quite neat.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. I think the cerebellum is super important for behavior and acting in the world, and just building policies like you said, whereas the cortex is primarily concerned with dealing with stimuli. And I'm not sure, like I think it's really easy for us to go, there's going to be one algorithm and it's going to be the algorithm which rules them all. But I don't know if that is actually the case, just given how different parts of the brain look and different neuronal structures behave. But yeah, definitely go look at the cerebellum. Also look at the basal ganglia. It's a cool part.
Hey, Matt. I just have a general interest question. You mentioned how like one of the things that you didn't like about PredNet was sort of it uses global information. It's not really biologically plausible. Like just out of curiosity, there are like other sort of alternatives for like doing estimation. Like I think there's a framework called Nango out there which does sort of more biologically plausible methods. I was just curious, like, is that something of interest? Do you know of people doing stuff in that? Just curious what your thoughts are.
There are definitely people looking into creating biologically plausible networks, and maybe not even entirely biologically plausible, but making them less rigid as we have them, right? Our current deep networks are inspired a lot by, I have a slide. That's one slide. All right, here we go. By hierarchical models of object recognition, which is like I think it's from the 60s and inspired some of the earlier work in like pandemonium and early neural network work, where the stimuli is passed feed forward through a series of learned filters. And while that is inspired by biology and like really looks at biology and trying to explain how the brain deals with stimuli, it loses out on a whole bunch of things. And so I think there is a lot of interest in understanding what parts of the biology are we missing out on. So say feedback connections and inhibition. Also plasticity is another one that I'm really interested in to induce modularity in our networks. And there are people working on it. So one example actually is DeWall is starting a project in it's called co-agent networks, and it's basically a network where each node is acting like a agent in its environment, and its goal is to maximize its reward signal given what's called an co-MDP. The idea has progressed much farther than that, and I'm not as familiar as DeWall is, so you should go talk to him and see if he has some interesting insights there. But yeah, I think there's a lot of interest in expanding the language of neural networks beyond what is currently possible and towards biologically relevant things. You should also look into like spiking networks and then spike train plasticity or spike dependent plasticity. Those are also biologically inspired networks where they have replaced our activation functions with more temporal, like more things like actual spike trains. So that's maybe one place to start looking if you're interested.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Matt, it's Joseph here. I've got a question.
Hey, Joseph. Yeah.
So this is all fun stuff. I like this whole area, as you might know. When you're examining this work, the predictive coding from Andy Clark and the Rao and Ballard work much earlier, I think both take a fairly Bayesian perspective on what it means to be a prediction. When we typically use GDFs, we take a more frequentist perspective. And what this does is it changes the nature of what are the semantics of the prediction, what information do we bring, what information is based on the data stream. In your readings of these works, do you find that you are able to reconcile the differences? Like, when you read their examples, are you able to interpret them from a frequentist standpoint, or do they require the Bayesian structure? Similarly,
that is yeah. Go ahead.
Also, the converse holds, right? When you do things with GBFs, you find a Bayesian perspective easy, or do you find it hard? Like, they all use the similar words, but their underlying mathematics and their semantics are different. So.
Yeah, and I think some of their examples do require that Bayesian take, especially when you start traipsing into active inference and the free energy principle. Whether or not like the original explanations like Rao and Ballard's or some of his name's Spratling, I think, whether they require the Bayesian interpretation, I'm not too certain. I don't really know. I haven't thought much about porting over the Bayesian perspective into our more frequentist perspective. What I do know is that like predictive coding in terms of, or what I have thought about predictive coding in terms of using GVS or using TD in any way, it doesn't seem all that compatible, right? Like, to be able to feed forward the error, you need so much more information about the world than you do when you're doing just like myopic predictions. And I think that's a huge limitation. But I'm wondering, yeah, I think it's something that I should think more about. Thank you for bringing it up. And I think it's something that I should think more about.
Thank you, Matt. This is Robin. My quick question is, how does memory play into this? Like, if you perceive your grandmother's face, is that recognition at the top of one of these columns in one of the LSTMs, or is that memory somewhere else?
That's a really good question. So I am going to say I don't know, to be honest, and I don't think anyone really knows how all of this interplays together. But one of the explanations that I really liked came from the On Intelligence book by Jeff Hawkins. So the neocortex and the cortex ends in the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is responsible for a lot of memory making and the shifting from short-term memory to long-term memory. And the way he describes memory is like the things that get up to the highest levels of the neocortex, the highest levels of abstraction, are the new things, or the novel things, the things we need to make memory. And if they're present in the hippocampus and around in the hippocampus, they eventually move downstream towards memory. I don't know if that's like a great explanation for what's actually happening in the brain, but it's something that it's a neat explanation and ties everything together. But again, caveats of lots of salt, lots of hand wringing, and lots of hand waving.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, if there are no more questions, let's all thank Matt for the cool talk.
Thanks, everyone.